Welcome to this explainer. Right now, we're going to do something a little bit dangerous. I want you, as a student, to step into the shoes of a critical philosopher. We are going to take a massive magnifying glass to the very foundations of traditional ethics. For centuries, a lot of philosophers have just completely trusted that human beings possess this innate, perfectly reliable moral compass. But today, we're building a prosecutor's case against moral certainty, and we're going to use the absolute sharpest tools that modern psychology has to offer. We have to ask a deeply uncomfortable question here. What if your most profound, deeply held moral convictions are literally nothing more than biological reflexes and psychological glitches? So let's look at our syllabus of skepticism for today. We'll start with the history between philosophy and psychology, define our main target, which is moral intuitionism, and then dive into evolution and peer disagreements. After that, we'll expose some morally irrelevant influences hacking our brains, look at how this breaks traditional philosophical methods, and finally, we'll turn our critical eye back onto the scientific data itself.
Starting off with Section 1, Philosophy and Psychology's History, the Rift and the Reconciliation.
Okay, before we go on the attack against modern theories, we've got to understand that using psychology to answer philosophical questions, it isn't actually a new trick. Psychology has always belonged in the philosophical arena. Look all the way back to antiquity. Aristotle was seamlessly blending his ethics with observation-based psychology. Fast forward to 1739, and you've got David Hume actively using psychological principles of association to explain how we make moral judgments. They were essentially sister disciplines. But then we hit a messy 20th century divorce. In 1903, G.E. Moore deployed what he called the open question argument, basically claiming you couldn't define normative terms like good in purely scientific or naturalistic terms. Well, philosophers kind of overreacted to this, completely turning their backs on psychology for decades. It wasn't really until the 1990s, with thinkers like Owen Flanagan, that we finally started to see a reconciliation, bringing that crucial empirical data right back into the ethical fold where it belongs.
Moving to Section 2, the threat to intuitionism, defining the target.
Any good critical philosopher will tell you that before you dismantle an argument, you absolutely have to define it first. So our primary target today is moral intuitionism. Broadly speaking, this is the epistemological belief that at least some moral truths are just self-evident. The intuitionist claims that when you see a moral wrong, you don't need independent confirmation. You don't need to do a bunch of complex logical math to know it's wrong. Your intuition just reliably tells you. But as a student of skepticism, alarm bells should be ringing. Claiming something is just self-evident leaves it incredibly vulnerable to empirical scrutiny. To really grasp this vulnerability, I want you to imagine a box containing exactly 100 thermometers. Now imagine you know for an absolute fact that 50 of them are completely broken. If you close your eyes, reach into that box, and just pull one out at random, are you going to trust the temperature it reads? No way. Not without independently verifying it against something else first. And this brilliantly illustrates our core problem. If modern psychology proves that a huge portion of our moral intuitions are broken or distorted, we simply can no longer blindly trust any single moral intuition that pops into our heads without verifying it. Which brings us to Section 3, Origins and Peer Disagreements, Evolution and Conflicting Views. We're diving into our first major empirical assault on moral certainty right now. Let's look at how the human brain actually evolved. The psychologist Joshua Green proposed a dual process model of moral judgment, arguing that our brains basically use two very different systems. System 1 is fast. It's automatic, unconscious, and it tends to output very rigid, rule-based, deontological judgments. Think never push a man off a bridge. System 2, on the other hand, is conscious, controlled, and slow. That's the system outputting consequentialist judgments based on calculating costs and benefits. The kicker here? Green points out that System 1 is essentially a bunch of blind evolutionary reflexes. It was shaped by natural selection to make sure tribes survived and cooperated, not to act like a radar for objective, mind-independent moral truths. If our strongest gut reactions are just survival instincts in a trench coat, trusting them to uncover objective morality is a pretty flawed strategy. And to make matters worse, we have the argument from peer disagreement. Think about people who are just as rational as you are, your epistemic peers. They systematically disagree with you on huge moral issues based purely on demographic luck. It's wild. Older adults tend to judge moral transgressions way more harshly than younger adults. People with higher socioeconomic status are generally more permissive of harmless taboos than folks with lower incomes. And culture, that creates massive divides. Take the United States. People in the South are far more accepting of using violence to defend personal honor compared to people in the North. So if two equally intelligent people look at the exact same action and come to total opposite conclusions based just on their age, their bank account, or their zip code, well, it severely undermines the rather arrogant idea that any of us have a direct hotline to objective moral facts.
Section 4. Morally irrelevant influences. The mind's glitches.
Okay, so disagreement is bad enough, but let's bring out the heavy empirical artillery. We're going to see how you can actually disagree with yourself. It is shocking how easily the idealized rational moral agent is compromised by things that literally have nothing to do with morality. Just honestly reflect on this. Would you change your deep-seated moral code just to fit in with strangers? Or just because you had a terrible, frustrating day at work? You probably want to say absolutely not. But psychology says otherwise. Studies on social conformity show that just being around people who express a different moral judgment, even just in a totally anonymous online chat room, can unconsciously overwrite your own deeply held moral evaluations. People will abandon their autonomous judgment just to align with the herd. This brings us to something called the framing effect. It proves your moral compass can spin wildly based on totally superficial factors. Let's say a researcher asks you to evaluate two moral dilemmas. Your answer will actually change depending on which dilemma they show you first. That's an order effect. Or consider word effects. People will say a sacrificial action is totally fine if the scenario says the action saves a specific number of people. But they'll completely condemn the exact same action if the text says it kills the rest. The math is identical. The outcomes are identical, but your moral judgment is being manipulated purely by the phrasing. And we really have to talk about the devastating impact of incidental affect. We're talking about temporary emotions. Studies suggest that if you're exposed to a bad smell, or if you're made to drink something bitter, or even if you're just put in a foul mood, the harshness of your moral judgments drastically goes up. Just imagine condemning someone's actions more severely, not because what they did was actually worse, but just because there was a gross smell in the room when you made the decision. These totally arbitrary physical feelings can completely distort what we think are deeply rational, objective moral evaluations. Section 5. Flaws in reflective equilibrium. A house built on sand. So, if our intuitions are compromised by evolution, demographic luck, word framing, and weird smells, how does this actually impact traditional philosophy? Think about the most revered philosophical method of the last century, reflective equilibrium. Jean Rawls famously championed this. The method basically says, start by taking your considered moral judgments about specific cases, then formulate general rules, and just keep revising both of them until they align perfectly into a coherent system. But as a critical student, look at step 1 right there. You start with your particular moral judgments. Well, if we just proved that those initial gut judgments are corrupted by framing effects and bad moods, then the whole staircase collapses. You aren't discovering objective truth. You're just organizing your own psychological biases into a really neat, coherent system. There's a historical analogy that critics of this method love to use. Building a grand, towering ethical theory upon the shifting, unstable sands of flawed psychological intuitions is ultimately a fool's errand. It doesn't matter how beautifully structured your house of reflective equilibrium is. If the foundation itself is made of untrustworthy cognitive glitches, that house simply cannot stand. Finally, Section 6. Can we trust the science? Turning skepticism inward. Now, a true philosopher never stops questioning, not even their own arguments. So we have to ask, is the empirical weapon we just fired actually loaded? Let's dive into a massive critical caveat. Right now, psychology is battling a severe replication crisis. The very empirical data we just used to debunk intuitionism, it might be fundamentally flawed. For example, those famous studies we just talked about, the ones claiming a bad smell or a bitter taste makes you morally harsher. Several high-profile labs have tried to repeat those exact experiments and completely failed. We're getting null results on anger and demographic shifts. We're finding serious methodological weaknesses, incredibly low statistical power, and a pervasive publication bias, where journals only want to publish the flashy, exaggerated effects. The hard truth we have to face is that the science proving our minds are glitchy is currently pretty glitchy itself. Which leaves us right here. If human psychology is too fundamentally flawed to ground absolute moral certainty, and the empirical science is too unstable to prove those flaws definitively, where exactly does that leave you? I want you to really sit with that profound, uncomfortable uncertainty. We definitely haven't solved morality today, but we have absolutely destroyed the illusion that it's simple, self-evident, or perfectly rational. As you move forward in your studies, keep this Skeptic's Toolkit close by. And whatever you do, never stop investigating this messy, fascinating intersection between the human mind and moral truth.